Two fixed ideas cannot coexist in the moral sphere, just as two bodies cannot occupy the same space in the physical world. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my Ru-Lit series on Russian literature. Today we continue talking about The Queen of Spades, a novella by Alexander Pushkin. If you haven't seen episode 1, I recommend checking it out first. Meanwhile, let's dive into this tale of mystery, card games and love. Last time we discussed gambling, both as a plot device of The Queen of Spades, but also a social disease of the early 19th century Russia. After hearing a story of a miraculous win, Herman becomes obsessed with the idea of 3 magic cards. You might think that this contradicts what I said in the previous episode about his cautious and careful personality. In fact, it makes perfect sense. He believes that these 3 cards will surely bring him the wealth he craves. In this situation, 2 sides of his mind clash. As Pushkin puts it, 2 fixed ideas cannot coexist in the moral sphere, just as 2 bodies cannot occupy the same space in the physical world. And so Herman sets out on a quest to meet the old countess and get the secret out of her. The Queen of Spades was one of the first stories that became a foundation for one of the first full-feature films in Russia. So in 1916, an adaptation of the story came out. And later it continued to be an extremely popular book to adapt. No wonder, if you read it, you notice how cinematographic this piece is. The first gambling scene is full of flashbacks, and even the silent film of 1916 uses this moment to dive into the countess's past and linger for a few moments on the scenes of gambling, her clash with the husband, and her date with Saint-Germain. After that, the story turns our attention, again very film-like fashion, to the old countess' house, and Pushkin takes time to describe her with precision that nails down the appearance of a very old lady. She's 87, which is probably an equivalent of being something like 102 years these days. The old countess was sitting in her boudoir in front of the mirror. The countess had not the least pretension to beauty, by now long faded, but had retained all the habits of her youth. She clung rigidly to the fashions of the 70s and was as meticulously long over her toilet as she was 60 years before. The countess is described as miserly and sunk in cold selfishness, like all old people who have drunk their fill of love when young and are alienated from the present day. She involved herself in all the vanities of high society. She would haul herself along to dances and sit in the corner, heavily rugged and dressed in antique fashion. The Queen of Spades was written in 1833, and that's when the events of the novella take place. The most characters are young, in their late teens or early 20s, but the countess belongs to a past century. The 70s, in the previous quote, refers to 1770s, of course. And she represents the 18th century, with its rich and bulky dresses, powered wigs, magicians, as Count Saint-Germain, and ceremonious manners. She also represents old age and death, something that would come up in Pushkin's works many times, from Eugene Onegin to his short stories. This is a clash between generations, a generation that lived through the time when the magicians would be honorable members of the society, and the generation of Herman, who also tries to process the idea of magic with a hint of rationality, which eventually brings him to his downfall. By the way, I really recommend seeing the adaptation of 1916. It is available on YouTube, and since it's pre-revolutionary, it gives you the idea of how people would be dressed in the early 19th century versus the 18th century. The countess is being assisted by her ward, Lisa. This was a common practice for elderly or widowed ladies to keep a poor relative or a ward by their side. not as a servant. They would attend balls, see people, but still these girls would be utterly dependent on their benefactors. Pushkin characterizes her as the most forlorn creature. The breath of a stranger is bitter, says Dante, and painful the steps of a stranger's stair. And who would know the bitterness of dependency better than the poor word of a society lady? Lisa, or Lizaveta Ivanovna, you have to get used to the fact that there can be many versions of the same name in Russian stories, feels miserable, being constantly reprimanded and mistreated by the old lady. Her only hope is to get married and be rescued from this situation. And this is what she is eagerly waiting for. She had her pride and felt her position keenly. She was ever on a lookout, impatiently waiting for a deliverer. The young men, however, calculating in their fickle vanity, did not favor her with their attention. And this is when Lisa starts noticing a young engineer standing outside their house and constantly looking at her. Later, she receives love letters from this young man, and her imagination is sparkled with hopes of a mutual love and a happy marriage. However, as it turns out, looks are often deceptive, and this is what we will explore next time. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please join me next time for the last Queen of Spades episode, where we will discuss the theme of madness in Queen of Spades. Check the links in the description for 2 English translations of the Queen of Spades and the early silent adaptation of this story. See you next time. Bye bye.